Hey everybody, welcome back to a quick look for AP World History. Today we're going to look at decolonization of the Third World. And I just want to remind you guys from our study on the Cold War that the Third World is referring to areas of the world that are not included as allies of the United States, nor of the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc. And so when we talk about the Third World, generally we're talking about places in Latin America or Africa or in South and Southeast Asia. And so I'll show you a couple of examples of this in just a little bit. Today's topic, we're just going to talk more generally about decolonization. This is just a newspaper article about the independence of India, so it's kind of a clue into one of the things that we're going to be looking at here. So we'll start out here by talking about just the end of empires and decolonization. So decolonization itself, when we are defining this term right here, decolonization, it's a process by which these colonies in Africa and in Asia, they gain independence from European rule. And so that refers specifically to decolonization, but for the purposes of the AP class, a lot of times in this section, we also include the development of new states because of the collapse of empires. So if you look over here, on this map, you see a map we've seen before, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the new states that developed out of that. And so those are included usually in this section. But I just wanted to clarify for you that when we're talking about decolonization, it's usually referring to the end of imperial rule, European imperial rule in places like Africa and Asia. So this occurred in the context of collapsing empires and the world wars. And sometimes these empires are collapsing as a result of the wars. And then sometimes they're not exactly connected. But the two world wars, World War I and World War II, were very important in the collapse of significant empires. So World War I, it's the collapse of Austria-Hungary, the collapse of the old Russian Empire, which turns into the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which leads to Turkey, among other nations, etc. Whereas after World War II, the demise of the empires are actually usually your maritime empires, the colonial empires of Europeans, of their nations, their states in Africa and in Asia. These are predominantly driven by nationalism. So this is especially true in Africa, that nationalism drives these independence movements. Again, they're related to the wars, but this general sense among colonials following the world wars is that these people have fought for freedom and independence in the world, and they really begin to identify themselves with a national identity and also recognize that their contributions to freedom and independence in the world ought to be also given to them as well, so or rewarded, I should say. This is a key or a really important point here. Most of these movements are going to be led by Western educated colonial elites. And so a lot of the more famous individuals, like, for example, Gandhi, among others, these people often are high class, high caste. They're often able to benefit from that status by getting a Western education. So Gandhi was educated in Britain as a lawyer. And he's not the only one. A lot of the people who become the leaders of these movements are typically elites. And that's kind of an interesting trend in world history. You tend to see those who are already pretty well off are typically the leaders of the movements. You see that in the American and French revolutions, among other things. So that's kind of an important point to notice. Some of these movements are violent, some of them are peaceful. And in a lot of these cases, the violence or upheaval that took place was after decolonization rather than during decolonization. And you see this a lot in the African states, and also in Southeast Asia. The major events that where there's bloodshed to a large degree happen after decolonization takes place. And then to kind of give you a connection to the Cold War here, all of these newly independent states are, I mean, many of them are gaining their independence during the Cold War. And so after 1945, these independent states are in many ways going to become Cold War battlefields, or at least battlegrounds for influence. Not necessarily military conflict, but definitely battlegrounds for influence from the US or from the Soviet Union. So these two maps that are on the screen now, we'll this map first on the left. You'll notice that it's broken up by nation. So you have kind of this area, which is covered, which is French colonies, and then you've got a bunch of British colonies near Egypt, and then South Africa, Nigeria, and there are a number of different nations that are represented, European nations that rule different parts of Africa. And the map now on the right side, if you look at it, you can see the borders. You can see the colors and the borders are, there's differences. This is what the map of Africa looks like now. Most recently, I believe it is an updated map. But what's really interesting, there are parts to this map where you can recognize the old colonial borders still exist. And so a really easy one to tell is where the Congo is, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Belgian Congo, right in the center. I mean, it's almost exactly the same. And that's a really important development of decolonization. And it's been really important in African development in the 20th century, kind of piggybacking off of the scramble for Africa and the division of Africa after the Berlin Conference. And the trend is that a lot of times these borders are drawn without respect to cultural or ethnic makeup groups and things like that, and linguistic groups. And when these places are decolonized, you still see that same sort of kind of just the same maybe ignorant mindset, I suppose we could say, associated with decolonization. And it's just really interesting. And a lot of those nations, if you were to go to Africa today and visit, they would speak not only their own cultural language, but they would probably also speak the language of the colonizing nation that they used to be subservient to. So it's really interesting. So that's an example of what we're talking about when we're speaking of decolonization in Africa. This map here is Asia. And so again, Asia was not as thoroughly colonized, not as parceled out as Africa was for numerous reasons. But you can kind of see what happens. You've got India, and a lot of the British colonies are decolonized in the 40s, and then you see a lot of Southeast Asia down here is decolonized in the 50s or in the 60s, and so it just gives you an idea of that these are the regions of the world that we're talking about that are decolonized. And they are all decolonized for different reasons in different circumstances. And so we'll talk about a few of those things today. So we'll start a little bit with India. I want to go over a little bit with you about what's going on in India. So two organizations are formed that are both, nationalist organizations in some sense. Definitely the INC, the Indian National Congress, formed originally in 1885. Their big push was inclusion. This is where this guy over here, Gandhi, comes from, or as far as like his historical significance. He was one of the members of the INC. The INC, as I mentioned, they were more interested in inclusion in affairs of India than anything else. And then by the mid 30s, there's a push for self-rule. It's really interesting. So India, it's possible that had things gone differently, India might have been able to attain self-rule earlier, but it ended up not being until after World War II in 1947 with the India partition, which you see that right here. The other one that I kind of underlined was the Muslim League. Okay, so the Muslim League, as the name states, is a organization of Muslims. You have to remember, in Indian history, prior to the British, the most recent organized state was led by the Mughals, which was a Muslim-ruled state. Muslim minority, but still the ruling minority. And so there's a pretty significant minority of Muslims that also were looking for independence, but they also wanted a separate Muslim state. And so the British solution to that was known as the India Partition, which was accomplished in 1947. And I'll show you a picture of that on the screen in just a minute. You see a similar development in Africa, in South Africa, with the African National Congress. And that was started in 1912. And the difference with the South African situation compared to India is that independence already was achieved. Independence actually was achieved by 1910. And so whereas India's National Congress was created as a vehicle or a mechanism to achieve self-rule eventually, the African National Congress is created following independence, and its major issue is dealing with apartheid. And that was a period of time in South African history where you basically see Jim Crow style segregation in South Africa. And to some degree, you could suggest it was worse in South Africa than it was in the United States, although that I would say that that's debatable for various reasons. So the South Africans, though they had independence already, it was more of a fight for social equality than for self-rule. So that's one of the big differences between the developments in India and the developments in Africa. And by the way, this guy right here, Nelson Mandela, that's this name, and he ends up, after apartheid is over, becoming South Africa's first black president, which was quite an achievement at the time. One other really important thing to note about both of these individuals, Mandela and Gandhi, is that both, as I mentioned, were educated elites. So Gandhi was high caste in India, and Nelson Mandela was from a fairly well-off family, black family in South Africa. And both subscribed to this idea of nonviolent resistance, which became a really popular form of protest and resistance basically in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Another example of that would be in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for civil rights. That was also a nonviolent resistance mentality. So that was a popular idea worldwide, definitely during the mid-20th century. So here's a picture that shows you the India partition. And what you actually see is you have these two green areas here. And I'll reiterate this in just a moment. But those two green areas, originally, when the partition was instituted, they were both called Pakistan. But the one on the left side there was called West Pakistan, and the one on the right side was called East Pakistan. However, later on, it would be renamed to just Pakistan, which is the one on the left, and then Bangladesh, which is the one on the right. So this was one of the key developments following World War II was the British releasing India and creating a partition. And the reason they created the partition was to accommodate both the Indian Hindu majority and the Indian Muslim minority. So a couple other things I want to mention. Some existing power structure reactions. This is something the College Board wants us to go over. One of the kind of categories here was that there were conflicts already existing or already in progress, or that were intensified or grown by different sorts of developments. So we've got a couple of examples. In Chile, you have a guy named Augusto Pinochet who became a dictator, and that story, which was really significant in understanding the U.S. role in Latin America. Like Chile's story is pretty typical of a lot of Latin American nations, and it was that the U.S. backed a coup of a socialist government in Chile and allowed Pinochet to take power, even though he was a dictator, which obviously is anti-democratic. The key here is that what we were opposing was the socialist government, because remember, after World War II is over, it becomes all about the Cold War and the ideological conflict between the West and the communist world. So that's important to remember. Another example here in Uganda, you have a guy named Idi Amin who also used a coup to overthrow the government, and that there's a couple of reasons for what was going on in Uganda. It wasn't like everything was just peachy. There was some turmoil going on already, and Amin just used the situation and also the realization that he was about to get arrested for money laundering and other economic corruption. Used a coup to overthrow that government and became a highly oppressive dictator. And then a couple of other movements emerged that were definitely, it wasn't just an escalation or an intensification of the conflict, it was actual violent movements. And two specific examples the College Board gives are the Shining Path movement in Peru during the 1980s. This was having to do with the development or the emergence of a communist party in Peru, and they were highly violent in their movement. And again, the U.S. did offer or pledge support, at least politically speaking, pledge support, not for the Shining Path movement, but against the Shining Path movement because of their stance as a communist group. Another one which should ring a bell for you guys is Al-Qaeda. And we know them because of 9/11, but they have existed since the end of the 1970s. They're a fundamentalist Islamic group which emerged during the Afghan-Russian War. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, there was a group that was called the Mujahideen, and Al-Qaeda was a group that was kind of, I'm not saying they were part of the Mujahideen, but they were tied to the Mujahideen as part of the resistance effort against the Russians. And so the examples here on this slide are so that you understand that not everybody responded to state control, whether it be imperial state control or simply state control in general. Not everybody responded with peace. There was oftentimes escalating conflict or just flat out violence that was used against the power structures of the time. A couple of examples of state creation and the political conflict that was created as a result. The India partition, which was mentioned earlier, creating an India and a Pakistan. The key here is that the ultimate social effect here was that it displaced and resettled millions of both Hindu and Muslim Indians, and the residual conflict from that was extremely important. And so one example of something that happened as a result, Gandhi ended up being assassinated by a Hindu extremist because the feeling was that Gandhi didn't push hard enough for a unified and independent India that was Hindu dominated. And so just the sense that I want you to have is that the India partition was not just this clean exchange of lands and where nothing bad happened. It actually did create some pretty significant political and social conflict as a result. Another development in the 40s, the creation of Israel, and this is important still today for numerous reasons. But Israel ended up being created because of the sympathy that was given to the Jews following the Holocaust. Now, the idea of a nation for Israel or for the Jews goes back to actually something called the Balfour Declaration, which was, I believe, in 1917, which talked about the idea of establishing a nation for Jews. But it obviously did not come to fruition until following World War II and the Holocaust. So the UN announced a partition plan in 1947. I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. And the partition was not accepted by the Arab nations that were surrounding the region called Palestine. And when the partition was accomplished and the state of Israel was formed in 1948, there were numerous wars. There was a war that was fought immediately upon the establishment of Israel, which Israel ended up winning. And there have been, I believe, 4 or 5 subsequent wars since then as well between Israel and its neighboring states over its creation. And there is still plenty of conflict in the Middle East, in Palestine, relating to this issue. Cambodia, just a really quick point here, after French rule. So Cambodia used to be with Vietnam and Laos in what was called French Indochina. And following World War II, again, as Indochina, different parts of Indochina were declaring their independence and trying to achieve independence, including the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh, which was mentioned in a previous slideshow. The Cambodians also sought their own rule, and the end result of that was called the Kingdom of Cambodia. It lasted from 1953 until 1970, but that ended up devolving into civil war, and it led to the emergence of a group called the Khmer Rouge. And this was a communist group, and as part of this communist kind of takeover, there was over 1 million people that were slaughtered in genocide as a result of the atrocities that the Khmer Rouge committed. So again, the creating new states doesn't mean everybody's happy, and it doesn't mean that it's without conflict and without bloodshed. And I hope that you see that from this. So here's just a couple of images. One, a newspaper article talking about the establishment of Israel. The image on the left here, you see the UN partition plan. Now, Israel does not look like this exactly today. It looks a lot, the Jewish state is actually much more of the region now, and a lot of that goes to the wars that have taken place since the partition and the establishment of the state of Israel. And most of that, or these wars were not initiated by Israel. They were initiated by the Arab nations surrounding Israel, and the land that Israel now possesses was acquired by virtue of winning those wars. And Israel has actually given back a lot of land since the end of those wars in the time since then. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's just really complicated, and it's hard to really be fair to both sides and assess it, objectively. Decolonization and socioeconomics. So just a couple quick points here. Oops. Oh no. Colonial rule. One of the problems with colonial rule is that it was designed not for the colonies, it was designed for the mother country. So the infrastructure had not been provided for economic development beyond beyond independence. And so what's happened is now we have this issue of unequal development where we've got nations that are considered to be underdeveloped or developing nations that have not had sufficient time or resources to be able to grow their economies to be part of the more developed world. And so that's a result of, especially in Africa, the use of things like cash crop agriculture and things like that. So the economies of the colonies were not robust enough to really engage with and enter into the global economy at large, at least for a while. A lot of nations in Africa are growing now, but that proved to be a big problem for them initially. I've got this point here called urban bias, and that has to do with, in a lot of these developing nations, a lot of economic resources and growth initiatives are much more focused in the urban centers in these newly independent states, and that has created some problems that these nations now have to deal with. And I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail there, but just suffice to say, the large urban centers in these new states definitely got the brunt of the resources and the development and growth. Another point here, the new state governments strongly guided the economic life in these states. And the reason they did that was because, again, the infrastructure didn't exist and the private sector was not well developed. And so they didn't have a kind of a private economy that could push development. The problem with this was that it was unstable and there was a lot of upheaval because of the weaknesses of the new governments that were put into place after Europeans left the nations that they had formerly colonized. Another point to mention here, migration. Okay, again, we've talked about this a little bit. Migrations happen for numerous reasons. There's different push and pull factors. And one of those has to do with work. And so a lot of the formerly colonized peoples migrated to the urban centers in what are called imperial metropoles. And basically what that means is that they're the large cities in the countries that used to colonize them. So an example would be a person in India traveling to either London or Manchester in England, those urban centers. So you've got examples, South Asians to Britain, Algerians to France, Filipinos to the United States. These people are migrating and ending up in urban centers for the purpose of looking for work, among other things. But a lot of these people were able to kind of keep